It is a great pleasure to introduce this afternoon's plenary speaker, my postdoc mentor and close collaborator, Dan Schechter. Dan is the William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of Psychology at Harvard University and a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences. He completed his Ph.D. in Toronto with Endel Tolving, and during that time, he didn't just write his dissertation, but he also researched and wrote his first book. No pressure to the PhD students here in the audience today. This was a historiographic reconstruction of the life and science of German zoologist Richard Wolfgang Simon, who had ideas about memory back in the late 19th century that actually echo the theories of memory that we have today. Dan's gifts for meticulous investigation, for remembering the year, the issue, and the page numbers of probably every relevant journal article you might ever need to read, and for writing with ease prose that is easy to read, have seen him have a great career. He has mentored 50 trainees, published over 350 publications, and has almost 100,000 citations. And his works include 2 award-winning books, Searching for Memory, published in 1996, and The 7 Sins of Memory in 2001. Both of these were noted by the New York Times, and I'm sure a good many of us in the audience today, or at least those that are in my generation, were influenced in our early careers by these fascinating books. And so what took Dan Schechter into a career on memory? Well, after finishing his BA at UNC Chapel Hill, Dan had planned on continuing the clinical research he'd been doing as an undergraduate on self-injurious behaviours in children. However, a chance opportunity saw him take an RA job with Herbert Krovitz of the Krovitz-Schiffman word queuing paradigm fame. And in that job, Dan had lots of freedom to explore new ideas on memory. And also, as part of this job, he helped Krovitz organise volumes of notebooks containing observations about memory. And lucky for the field, this experience was transformational for Dan. And since then, he's delved into most aspects of memory, including implicit memory. He conducted some of the first imaging studies on episodic memory, memory distortions, and most recently, the work he'll tell us about today, how episodic memory is used for imagining the future and creative thought. Dan Schechter.
Okay, well, it's great to be here, and this is an amazing conference. And like a couple of the speakers yesterday, I do have vivid memories of speaking at the 1984 conference. And that was a terrific conference, too, produced a very fine volume, Memory Systems of the Brain, that I think had some notable impact on the field, but was not anything on the order of magnitude of this conference. And so I think that it augurs well both for the field that we have this kind of a large conference, and also speaks well of the growth of the center here and how it's continuing and adding to its role as a leader in our field. So I'm really happy to be here. And the work I'm going to talk about today is really work that has gone on in my lab basically for the last decade or so. But it is rooted in many ways in some of Endel Tolving's insights. I'm going to break with form, and I'm going over here a little bit, contrary to all the previous speakers. We'll go back and forth. So Endel Tolving, we all know, of course, in 1972, put forth the episodic semantic memory distinction, and in his original conception, episodic memory was defined as the ability to recollect specific past experiences, and that, of course, emphasizes that episodic memory is concerned primarily with the past, and that's what we tend to think of memory as being concerned with. But that began to change in the early 1980s as a consequence of some observations regarding a well-known amnesic patient who will be well known to many people here, known in literature by the initials KC. He was a young man in Toronto who had suffered a severe head injury that produced damage in the frontal lobe, medial temporal lobe, including hippocampus and parts of the parietal lobe. and left him with one of the most devastating memory impairments on record. He's as severe as an amnesic comes. And the most striking thing about KC was he could not recollect any particular episode from his past. I, along with Endel Tulving and Morris Moskovich, Betty Gliski, Mary Pat McAndrews, and others in the early 80s, tested Casey quite extensively, and I never saw him remember a single event. He could do lots of other things well. He showed priming, implicit memory, and all that sort of stuff. The relevant observation for today came from a testing session that I was fortunate to be present at. I still remember it well, where Tulving asked Casey a very simple question, but one that turned out to be quite revealing. Tell me, what do you think you're going to do tomorrow? Imagine what you might do tomorrow. And Casey, as many people here know, drew a blank in response to that question that was pretty much the same as what he would do if you asked him, tell me one thing you did yesterday. He wouldn't be able to come up with any particular thing. When pushed, he would say, well, maybe I'll have breakfast and have lunch, but he couldn't conjure up any particular imagine of future event. Well, that was very striking, and it certainly made an impression on me, and I impacted Tulving's thinking and the field's thinking, but nobody did much about it for a long time until the early and mid-2000s, when there was a sudden upsurge of research from a variety of labs examining the relationship between remembering past experiences and imagining future experiences. And I think what got people interested in this was the observation of some striking similarities between the two, both cognitively and neurally. I've listed, for those who don't know this area, a couple of review papers I've written with other people active in the field. Neuron a few years ago, and then more recently, Current Opinion in Behavioral Sciences, and a very nice special issue on space and time and memory. So it turned out that KC was not alone. There are many other amnesic patients who have difficulties imagining their personal futures, constructing novel scenes, some of the work of McGuire and Hassabis and their colleagues on scene construction. Not every amnesic has this problem. The Squire Lab has published a couple of articles indicating their amnesics are okay at imagining the future, but lots of other amnesic patients have problems in this domain. Studies of aging and psychopathology indicated that healthy older adults, patients with MCI and Alzheimer's disease, and individuals with various psychopathological conditions who had difficulties remembering the past showed similar difficulties when you asked them to imagine the future. Another similarity. And then neuroimaging studies began to show that many of the same areas are active when people remember the past and imagine the future in the scanner. And it was Donna who led the first study from our lab, first effort on this, which used a variant of the Krovitz queuing paradigm that I learned back in 1974 working for Herb Krovitz when he first put forward that paradigm. Very simple. You give people a cue word and then ask for either a related memory, remember the past, or use that cue word to imagine an event that could plausibly happen to you within a specified time period. And what this study showed was that when people did those tasks in the scanner, and you compared it to control tasks that required semantic processing and visual imagery processing, but not the requirement to either imagine or remember a personal episode, then there were this striking similarity in here showing the midline regions, medial prefrontal, retrosplenial, and other medial parietal regions that showed common activation when people remember the past, imagine the future. The same was true for medial temporal lobe regions, including the hippocampus and a couple of other regions. So based on those observations, in a Nature Reviews paper in 2007, Donna, Randy Buckner, and I postulated the existence of what we called a core network that supports remembering past experiences, imagining future experiences, and related kinds of mental simulations. And that network includes those midline regions we just looked at, as well as others that showed common activation in our study and the couple of others that were available at the time. We based this suggestion only on a couple of studies, and those of you, I'm sure just about everybody here would recognize that this, what we call the core network, overlaps largely with the default mode network, and we can use those terms interchangeably. But we did only postulate that on the basis of a couple of studies. Research in this area really expanded in the next number of years, and in a meta-analysis that was led by Roland Benoit when he was a postdoc in my lab, we were able to confirm the joint activation for episodic simulation, imagining future experiences in episodic memory in that network of regions on the basis of a much larger sample. Well, going back to 2007, Donna and I conceptually tied some of these findings on imagining the future to work and theory on constructive memory. We know memory is prone to error. And so what we suggested is that, first of all, episodic memory plays an important role in driving the similarities that I've spoken about and in imagining possible future scenarios. Episodic simulation, episodic future thinking, or episodic prospection are commonly used terms for this. And it does so by supporting flexible retrieval and recombination of elements of stored episodes to construct possible future episodes. And we suggested that this flexible recombination, the ability to take bits and pieces of different past experiences, put them together into a novel event simulation, is adaptive when we're trying to rely on memory for future simulation, because the future, after all, is rarely identical to the past. We want to have a flexible memory system that allows us to take bits and pieces of our experiences and combine them into something new to imagine and plan for an upcoming novel situation. So that's a good thing for purposes of future simulation, we suggested. But at the same time, we drew a link to memory errors and suggested that this flexible recombination process that's crucial for future simulation is something that can also result in memory errors when elements of different but related experiences are miscombined. That's a point that we didn't have much evidence on at the time. It was more of a theoretically driven suggestion, but on which we do have some evidence now. I'm just going to really flag it. I won't have time today to go into detail on these studies, but there's some recent work led by Alexis Carpenter, a postdoc in my lab, published in JP, Learning, Memory, and Cognition last year, and JP General this year, that I think provides some pretty neat evidence specifically linking flexible recombination and retrieval in episodic memory with memory errors that result from miscombining elements of distinct but related events. Those of you interested in following up on that point, I'd refer you to these papers from Alexis. Another paper that I just want to really very briefly mention, because it just literally came out yesterday in Psych Science on this same theme, is one led by Aaliyah Deffitt. Aaliyah was a graduate student with Donna and is currently a postdoc in my lab. And the title of this paper kind of gives away the bottom line: An Optimistic Outlook Creates a Rosy Past, the Impact of Episodic Simulation on Subsequent Memory. Aaliyah asked a very interesting question that really nobody had asked before, which is, when we project ourselves into the future and imagine an event, we imagine it turning out a certain way, does that affect how we later remember that event as compared to something we didn't simulate? And the answer is yes, and that it produces kind of a positive bias in remembering that's detailed in this paper that just came out if people are interested to have a look. Okay, so I focused on similarities between remembering the past and imagining the future. And I would say that they at least imply a role for episodic memory, or some aspect of episodic memory, in imagination and future thinking. But more recently, since Donna and I got started on this line of research, similar observations have been made about divergent creative thinking, which was defined by Guilford over 50 years ago as the ability to generate creative ideas by combining diverse kinds of information in novel ways. Sounds kind of like episodic simulation. So a few years ago, Melissa Duff and Neil Cohn and their colleagues published an interesting paper showing that amnesic patients exhibit deficits on divergent creative thinking tasks, and default network activity has also been observed in various studies, including one by Benedict et al. A few years ago, when people are engaged in divergent creative thinking tasks. But I would say that these observations don't really provide conclusive evidence that it's episodic memory that's playing a critical role in these, in either future imagining or divergent creative thinking, because we know amnesics typically have declarative memory deficits that include episodic memory, but are broader than that. They typically have some form of semantic memory problem. And of course, core or default network activity just observed on its own is not specifically diagnostic of episodic memory. It's consistent with that, but it could be consistent with many other things. So how do we get more directly at the question of, is it some aspect of episodic memory that really is playing a key role here? So our approach over the last few years has been to try to manipulate episodic retrieval in order to, in imagination, creativity, and related tasks that we wouldn't normally think of as episodic memory tasks, in order to obtain some stronger evidence. And what I want to tell you about today are first, are two types of manipulation. First, I'll tell you about a recent study on using a TMS to manipulate episodic retrieval. And then second, I'll tell you about a series of recent studies using a procedure we call in the lab an episodic specificity induction. So let's first talk about the TMS work. This is work that just came out a few months back in the Journal of Neuroscience. It's led by a current postdoc in the lab, Preston Thackrell, and it's based on the premise that previous studies have shown that inhibitory TMS to the left angular gyrus in the inferior parietal lobule impairs aspects of episodic memory retrieval, suggesting a role for this region in episodic memory retrieval. That's no doubt not the only thing that the angular gyrus does, been implicated in other functions, but there is evidence to suggest a role in episodic memory retrieval. So that leads to a natural question from the perspective of the role of episodic retrieval in future imagining. Does that impairment extend to episodic future simulation? So if we try to manipulate episodic retrieval through a TMS protocol, does that have a similar effect on remembering and also future imagining? That's the focus of this paper. So again, we're using that simple version, adapted version of a Krovitz and Schiffman paradigm. So after receiving inhibitory TMS, people either imagine a future experience that might occur to them plausibly within the next 5 years in response to a word cue, remember a past experience that occurred in the past 5 years, or just generate semantic associates as kind of a control task. The 30 seconds for each trial and each task, and the tasks are administered in blocks of 5 following the TMS protocol, which is applied to the left angular gyrus, shown here, and it is 1 hertz repetitive TMS applied for about 10 minutes prior to the relevant task blocks. And for control, the vertex was used here as it is commonly in TMS studies. So if you first look at the control task, the semantic associates, people are generating free associates after getting these two kinds of TMS. There's no impact of the TMS to the left angular gyrus here. They're generating just as many free associates as they are after vertex stimulation. Then we looked at the remembering and imagining task, and as many studies in this domain do, details of the remembered and imagined experiences were coded into what are termed internal and external details in the autobiographical interview, well known to many here, from Brian Levine and colleagues a number of years ago. So they're raters who are blind to condition. They get the protocols, the output that people provide when they're remembering and imagining, and they break them down into internal, external details. So internal details are basically episodic details. People, locations, objects, actions in the remembered or imagined event. External details are a bit of a composite category that includes semantic information, for example, facts related to the episode, commentary about the episode, reference to other episodes. It's a bit of a potpourri of different kinds of information, but it can be reliably, these details can be reliably distinguished from internal. So in Preston's study here, we've got very high interrater reliability, above 0.8 for internal and external, which is typical studies in our lab using this procedure. So what happened, so if we look at the internal details first, what we find is that in memory, you get what you'd expect based on the prior literature showing angular gyrus related to episodic memory retrieval, a reduction in internal details following left angular gyrus inhibitory stimulation. Critically, the identical effect is observed when people are imagining a future event. They're doing it with fewer episodic internal details, common reduction. Does this apply to external details? No, it doesn't. In fact, it goes the other way. There aren't as many external details, but the number of external details now is actually higher after TMS to the angular gyrus than after the vertex stimulation. That may be kind of a compensatory response. So when you have fewer internal details available, there's some evidence in the literature indicating that there's kind of a compensatory response and you start providing external details. There's actually a paper led by Aaliyah Devitt with Donna and I that came out in Memory and Cognition, I think earlier this year, that makes this point, pulling together a bunch of different studies. Okay, so to summarize then, TMS to the left angular gyrus selectively and similarly impairs retrieval of episodic details when people remember the past, imagine the future. I think that takes us a little closer to implicating episodic retrieval as a key factor in future, the similarities between remembering and imagining that we have seen. Okay, for the next remaining part of the talk, I'm going to tell you about a series of studies that have unfolded over the last few years in the lab using this episodic specificity induction procedure. And I first want to mention that most of the work in my lab on this has been led by two individuals, Kevin Medor, who was, when he was a graduate student with me, is now a postdoc with Anthony Wagner at Stanford, and Helen Jing, who is currently still a graduate student with me. So what is ESI, episodic specificity induction? It's basically brief training and recollecting the details of a recent past experience. And to accomplish this brief training, we adapted a procedure that's been around for a long time known as the cognitive interview. It was developed by Fisher and Geiselman at UCLA in the 1980s initially as a forensic protocol to increase episodic retrieval and eyewitness. So the idea was you wanted to ask people questions that would pull out, maximize the amount of episodic detail that they could recall about an event without also inducing false memories through suggestions and the like. So that's why they adapted the cognitive interview. But we're not really that interested in exactly what people remember about a recent event. We're interested in the downstream consequences of putting people through this protocol. So the logic of these next experiments I'm going to tell you about is that our adapted version of the cognitive interview, it's not exactly the cognitive interview, but it uses a lot of the procedures. This, what we call the episodic specificity induction, should enhance performance on subsequent tasks that draw on episodic retrieval. The idea is that you're kind of priming up, activating episodic retrieval processes by getting people to do this detailed episodic unpacking of a recent experience. And it should impact later tasks that draw on episodic retrieval, having no impact on subsequent tasks that don't draw on episodic retrieval. So let's look more closely at these inductions. So typically in these experiments, what happens is people come into the lab, 2 sessions, sometimes a week apart, sometimes within the same session with everything counterbalanced, of course. And they see a video of people carrying out kind of unrelated activities in a kitchen. That's the target event. It could be a video of anything that happened to be something that was available and around the lab. So they see this video of people doing stuff in the kitchen, and then if they're getting the specificity induction, they're getting a series of mental imagery probes, tell me more probes, temporal order probes. So they would be told something like, I want you to close your eyes, get a picture in your head about the people in the video you saw. I want you to think about what they look like, what they're wearing. Once you have a really good picture, I want you to tell me everything you remember about the people in the video. Try to be as specific and detailed as you can. They would get that same kind of question for actions that took place, for objects, and so forth. Then what's the control induction? Well, we've used a couple of them, but the one I'm showing you here we call the impressions control. So now if you were a subject in this experiment, you'd come back the next week, you'd see a different video of people doing different things in a kitchen, And now you'd be asked to think back to the video, as with the specificity induction, but you would just give your general impressions. What were your impressions of the people? Did you like it? When do you think the video was made? So in both cases, you're thinking back on the video, but only in the specificity induction are you doing detailed episodic retrieval. And then you go on and do tasks of interest that I'll tell you about in a minute. So we've now done quite a few of these experiments in the lab, and the general finding that I'm going to illustrate for you by walking you through a couple of experiments is that the ESI indeed selectively boosts performance on tasks we hypothesized draw an episodic retrieval, and we'll begin by talking about a couple of experiments on imagining and simulating future experiences. I should mention, just parenthetically, that we've used a couple of different kinds of control inductions, the general impressions I just told you about. Sometimes we just have people do math problems, perhaps a more neutral baseline. The critical point is that the effects I'm going to tell you about are identical regardless of whether we're comparing the ESI to the impressions or math control. The control in our hands for our test is not important. Get the same results either way. Okay, so let's talk about this first study. This is one led by Kevin. First study we did with this procedure, published 2014. This actually emerged from a line of research on aging. One of the main reasons we got into the specificity induction business in the beginning was because we needed it to separate out episodic from non-episodic influences in older adults who we had done a bunch of studies with on remembering the past and imagining the future. So it was done as an aging study, this first one. People come in, they see that video of doing things in a kitchen, they get either specificity or a control induction, and then they go on and do memory, imagination, and description tasks that I'll tell you about in a minute. They come back a week later, they get whichever video they didn't get the previous week, and they get whichever induction they didn't get the previous week. So it's a different video. If they had specificity, now they get control, vice versa, everything counterbalanced. And then they go on to do a series of different memory and imagination and picture description tasks, or the same tasks using different stimuli. So here's an illustration. These were picture cues that were used. They were presented one at a time, and participants would have 3 minutes to either remember a past experience related to the picture. We think of that, of course, as an episodic dependent task that should be impacted by this prior induction. So if I showed you this picture, you might remember your vacation on Cape Cod last year and unpack as much episodic detail as you can. For the imagine condition, people were asked to imagine possible future experiences related to the picture that could happen in the next few years. Again, by hypothesis, we think this depends importantly on episodic retrieval. So I might show you this picture of the shopping mall, and you'd imagine going to your local mall and tell us about all the things you're going to buy and who you're going to go with and that sort of thing. And finally, critically, the control condition here was just picture description. Tell me what's in the picture, which we think is independent or should be independent of episodic retrieval. So now you're going to tell me there's a guy in a sport jacket dancing with a woman dressed in purple. There's another woman over here facing away from me. So it's just a literal description of what's in the picture. Coding is as before. So we're going to have independent raters, or we had independent raters code the trials for internal and external details based on the autobiographical interview. So for memory and imagination, it's exactly as I talked about before. For picture description, an internal detail is a detail that is physically, perceptually present in the picture, and the people agree is in the picture. That counts as an internal detail. External are the same. So what happened? Okay, so I'm showing you internal details separately for younger and older adults. The first thing you'll notice, and this replicates the earlier work that actually led to this work from Brendan Gesser in the lab, that older adults produce fewer internal details when they're remembering the past, imagining the future, or even just describing a picture. But the important point, the important new thing added by this study, is that having just received the specificity induction, you can see that for older adults and for younger adults, the blue bars are higher than the gray bars, which indicate gray bars are a number of internal details they produce after having received the control induction, blue bars after having received specificity. So they're producing more episodic detail when they remember and imagine to a similar degree after specificity than control induction. You might worry that this is just affecting their tendency to produce a lot of verbal output, but there's no difference in picture description. Performance here is a bit high, but with older adults, there's also no difference in picture description. So it seems to be selectively targeting the two tasks that we think are dependent on episodic retrieval, not impacting picture description. And when we look at external details, there's no impact whatsoever. Older adults produce more external details than younger adults. This is a very common finding, but it doesn't matter whether you just had a specificity induction or not, you produce about the same number. So again, it's not just increasing verbal output, it's more specific and selective in targeting episodic retrieval. Okay, I'll just give you even briefer summaries of a couple of studies from Helen Jing that I think illustrate some of the interesting places you can go, having established these findings. This is an experiment on worrisome future experiences that came out in the JP General 2016. We all worry at times about the future, especially in this crowd when grant deadlines approach. We may even stay up at night and have very vivid images of bad things that might happen. Good things too, but Helen's experiment was looking at the question of whether having had the episodic specificity induction might help you to deal more constructively with something you're worried about happening in your personal future. Okay, we were studying undergraduates, Harvard undergraduates, so we got undergraduate worries as our main target. So they'd come in for an initial session, be asked to list 30 specific concrete problems or events that are highly worrisome to them. So Harvard students have no problem coming up with 30 like that. This is, I knew we had a worried population. I didn't realize they were this worried. But so I'm worried about doing poorly on the final for my psychology class because that would bring down my GPA. So we get a whole bunch of these. And once we've got those, then they go into the following design, similar kind of setup as before. You come back for 2 sessions a week after you came in and gave your worrisome experiences. They're spaced a week apart. You see one of those videos. You get the specificity induction as we've discussed. And then you get problem solving and reappraisal tasks that address the worrisome event. So for problem solving, we adapted a means-end problem-solving task from Platt and Spivak in the 1970s. So in the example I gave you, the problem would begin with, the story begins with you being worried about getting a bad grade on your test. The story ends with you getting a good grade on your test. How do you get from the beginning to the end? So you've got to come up with relevant steps to solving this problem, and it draws on episodic simulation and episodic retrieval. Some work from Signe Sheldon and Morris Moskovich had shown that earlier, and some work from our own lab had shown that a basic form of this task is sensitive to the induction. So that's the problem solving. On the reappraisal task, you're asked to try to reframe the worrisome event. So try to think of it in a more positive way. Come back a week later, you get the same setup as before. You get whichever induction you didn't get the week before, and you do different versions of the problem solving and reappraisal tasks on different worrisome experiences. So what happened? Well, there are a number of results, but I'm just going to show you the actual data from one. The problem solving task, when you code the steps into relevant steps, things that help you solve the problem, and other steps, kind of irrelevant things that you might do, but blind raters are in agreement about what's relevant and not, you see a nice boost where they're coming up with more relevant steps, having just had the specificity induction to solve their worrisome problem. And again, it's not just a boost in verbal output. They actually produce fewer of the irrelevant or other steps. It's targeting what's relevant to solving the problem. And there were several other findings from this study. Again, I don't have time to unpack them. They're better able to do that reappraisal task. They're better able to reframe the problem after they've just had the specificity induction. And there are also some pre-post increases on a few measures of subjective well-being. They're less anxious after they've done this more constructive problem solving, having had the specificity induction. Helen Jing followed that up with a very nice paper just out in Cognition last year that focused on a related issue. So if you have a thing you're worried about, a negative experience in the future, to what extent can you generate alternative outcomes to that negative event? And so this study shows that you're better able to generate positive alternative outcomes to a feared negative event after you've just had the specificity induction. That was particularly nice because one of the early and still somewhat unrecognized pioneers in the episodic simulation area was David Ingvar, who was doing studies in Lund in the 1970s on using cerebral blood flow, where people would just be sitting doing nothing in the scanner, and he noted in a wonderful 1979 paper that the hyperfrontal pattern that he observed during rest when he was recording cerebral blood flow, he had associated that with a memory-based simulation of possible future experiences. So Ingvar said, on the basis of previous experiences represented in memories, the brain, one's mind is automatically busy with extrapolation of future events, constructing alternative hypothetical behavioral patterns in order to be ready for what may happen. The high cortical frontal cortical flows could be ascribed to a simulation of behavior, an anticipatory programming of several alternative behavioral modes prepared to be used depending on what will happen. So Ingvar really laid a lot of emphasis on this idea of simulating alternative outcomes. In the future, nobody did much about it, and then this Jing study is one of the first to actually look at it, and we see that episodic retrieval is playing an important role here because you can better come up with alternative outcomes when you've just had this induction. Okay, so that's a quick overview of some of the behavioral results. What's going on in the brain when people get this episodic specificity induction? According to the logic of my talk, regions within the core network, default network, should be impacted by having just had this induction, specifically regions that are associated with episodic retrieval, detailed episodic retrieval. So we looked at this question in a recent, in a paper that was published at PNAS at the end of 2016, led by Kevin, and the title sort of gives it away. Indeed, there is an impact of this induction on activity in the core brain network. We were particularly interested in activity in the hippocampus and the inferior parietal lobule, including the angular gyrus, and focused on those regions. So the tasks here, and Donna played a key role in this study as well. The tasks here were a future imagining task, just the standard kind of task. You're given a word cue in the scanner, imagine a future experience that could occur to you, and we get reports when they're out of scanning on exactly what those imagined experiences are. The control task is one that we had used in several previous studies with Donna, where you generate what we call a size sentence, including the cue word and two related objects, and define each word. It's proven to be a useful control for various kinds of simulation tasks. And these tasks follow either the specificity or control induction. That's done in the scanner, but the actual induction is not scanned. So if you just look at the simple contrast that you get for imagine greater than control, following separately specificity and control inductions, you get the typical picture of the core network coming online when you imagine compared to the control task, but you can even see by eyeballing that there's more robust activity in the vicinity of the hippocampus and also up in the inferior parietal lobule. And that was shown in a formal contrast where when you ask the question what regions that showed that boost in future imagining show it to a greater extent for specificity than control, indeed it's the left anterior hippocampus, inferior lobule, parietal lobule on the right, and the precuneus, which often shows up in kind of high greater than low memory contrast. There are also some interesting changes in functional connectivity, resting state functional connectivity. So looking at the relationship of the anterior hippocampal seed to other regions within the core network, there was increased connectivity with the right hippocampal gyrus, the right IPL seed that showed the key effect, showed increased activity with several other core network regions as well. So we think that based on the cognitive and neural results, we have a stronger basis now than we did before these experiments were done for concluding that episodic retrieval is contributing to future imagining by manipulating episodic retrieval. And we can start to tell a similar story for divergent creative thinking that I talked about earlier. So we got started on this with a behavioral project a couple of years ago, looking at divergent creative thinking by looking at one of the standard tasks in this area, the alternate uses task. So this is where you're asked to generate novel but appropriate uses for common objects, like a brick or a paperclip. So we want you to come up with something, or the test is going to give you credit for coming up with something that's an unusual use of a brick, but also appropriate, something that could be done. And you get scored for that. And then as the control task here, the subjects were given an object association task that involves little divergent thinking. You're just generating familiar associates to objects. This was reported in Psych Science a couple of years ago. Same setup as before, the video, specificity or control induction, and then following that, you do a version of the AUT, object association task. Come back a week later, same deal with a different induction and different versions of the task. And the result is pretty much as I have described for future imagining. Once again, you get a selective effect of the induction on the task that is hypothesized based on some of the evidence I talked about earlier and some other evidence to involve episodic retrieval. What I'm showing you here is one of the most commonly used measures of performance on the alternate uses task, the flexibility measure. It gives you sort of categories of appropriate uses, but you get the same thing for all measures of generative output on the AUT. More novel but appropriate uses after you just had the ESI than the control induction. And again, it's not just a non-selective effect to produce more stuff. There's no impact on the object association task. We replicated that within that same paper and then replicated and extended to older adults in a follow-up study in memory and cognition. These are still the same old data. Same data from the previous study, and also extended this basic result to another test of divergent creative thinking known as the consequences task, where you're given kind of bizarre situation. You have to imagine novel but appropriate consequences of these unusual situations. So it's impacting at least these two measures of divergent creative thinking. Again, we can ask what goes on in the brain during these tasks. So another paper on that. Just out recently in cerebral cortex, led by Kevin with a bunch of people in the lab, and Donna was involved in this one as well. I'm not going to walk you through all the details of the procedure. It's the same setup as before. They're in the scanner getting specificity or control induction, and now they're scanned while they do the alternate uses task or the object association task that we just showed you behavioral evidence for. And in that critical contrast that I showed you for the future imagining, once again, you get left anterior hippocampus, greater for specificity for then control and AUT over OAT. And you also see a couple of control regions, ventrolateral and dorsolateral prefrontal regions showing up. That turned out to be an important part of this story because there were two connectivity analyses that showed something interesting vis-a-vis connections between the hippocampal seed and one of those control seeds. Resting state connectivity analysis showed that this connection was stronger following the specificity than the control induction. And there was also a task-related functional connectivity procedure that was carrying out for looking at functional connectivity during task performance between the core network as defined from the Benoit meta-analysis that I showed you earlier, and the frontoparietal control network as defined in one of Justin Vincent's papers from about a decade ago. And the critical finding was that connectivity between these two networks was, during task performance, was increased for AUT, but importantly, increased following specificity relative to control induction. There was greater interaction, connectivity during task performance between the core and frontoparietal control networks. That was of particular interest because in a TICS paper that I co-authored with Roger Beatty, currently a postdoc in the lab, came out in 2016, on creative cognition and brain dynamics, one of the main messages, take-home messages from this paper, is that a signature feature of creative cognition measured in various ways is interaction between the default mode network and executive control networks, and that interaction seems to be enhanced when you do the AUT in this experiment, having just had the specificity versus the control induction. Okay, so summary then, we've got data from the TMS and ESI studies providing some clear evidence that episodic retrieval plays a role in future imagining, divergent creative thinking. Now, a natural question arises, how can we best characterize the nature of the episodic retrieval processes that contribute to imagination and creativity? And that's what I want to focus on in my last few minutes. Because this specificity induction similarly impacts imagination and creativity tasks, it seems that if we could characterize what this induction is doing, the nature of the processes impacted by the ESI, because it's having this sort of broad effect on remembering, imagining, problem solving, creativity, that should help us to understand how episodic retrieval can impact imagination and creativity in related processes. So I want to put forth two hypotheses and then show you one final study that attempts to distinguish between them. The first I'm going to call the constructive retrieval hypothesis. And so we've suggested, Medora and I, in a more of a theoretical review paper, that the ESI biases the adoption of a retrieval orientation to focus on episodic details, and that this retrieval orientation impacts what we term, borrowing some terminology from Morris Moscovich and his colleagues, an event construction process. That is, assembling a mental event with details related to places, people, objects, and actions. Related to Eleanor McGuire's scene construction notion, but doesn't focus so much on spatial aspects. And the idea would be that this constructive activity can have wide-ranging benefits on remembering, imagining, and thinking creatively. If this is what's going on and this is what's being impacted by that induction, something like this event construction process. An alternative is what I'm going to call the reproductive retrieval hypothesis. Alternatively, it could be that these ESI effects I've told you about depend on engaging verbatim or reproductive retrieval processes. So during the ESI, when we're giving the induction, people typically remember pretty much exactly what happened in the video that they just saw. They just saw it, it's pretty easy to remember. And the cognitive interview on which the ESI is based, it was designed to increase accurate retrieval, not to produce false memories, although it occasionally does. And it mainly does increase accurate retrieval. So the downstream effects that I've been telling you about of the specificity induction on imagination, creativity, and so forth could depend on this kind of reproductive retrieval process rather than an event construction process. Now, the problem we have is that, based on existing literature, is that we really have no basis to assess these hypotheses because the ESI effects I've told you about are observed on tasks in which questions concerning accurate or inaccurate details are either irrelevant, so it's not relevant to future imagining and creative thinking, whether the details you produce have accuracy or fidelity to some episode, or they're difficult to assess, autobiographical memories. So we try to contrast these two hypotheses, these two accounts, using an experimental paradigm that does allow us to distinguish between retrieval of accurate and inaccurate details, and this will be a well-known paradigm to many people here. It's kind of the tried and true Diess-Roeder-McDermott or DRM paradigm, probably the most reliable way to produce a robust false memory effect in the laboratory. So as most of you probably know, in this paradigm, subjects study lists of related words. They're all associates of a single word that isn't presented. So for this list, they're all associates of sleep. You never hear or see sleep during list presentation, but the finding, of course, is that people will tend to produce sleep on their own on a free recall test, or they'll endorse sleep as having been on the list at a very high level with high confidence and claim to remember sleep. So we focused on free recall here because we're going to do we're going to combine the ESI with the DRM, see how they work together. And specificity induction has affected mainly tasks that involve generative output, so we're focusing on recall here. And just to show you some data that the cognitive psychologists will be familiar with from Roediger and McDermott's paper, this is what you get when you show people a 15-word list like the sleep list and you plot recall as a function of serial position, they have best memory for the beginning and the end. They remember the items in the middle about 40%, and that's about how often they remember the critical lure word that was never presented. 40% of the time, they'll produce sleep, just it's behaving as if it was a word presented in the middle of the list. Okay, so the hypotheses. The reproductive retrieval hypothesis, well, if these ESI effects are based on retrieving veridical episodic details versus via reproductive retrieval, then the induction should primarily enhance true recall in the DRM paradigm, because it's boosting your ability to retrieve accurately episodic details that you just experienced. By the constructive retrieval hypothesis, if the ESI effects are based on retrieving constructed episodic details that may be inaccurate and don't reflect exactly what item you study, then the ESI should enhance primarily false recall. So I'm going to show you a couple of experiments. This is new work. Preston Thackrell has taken the lead on this under review. And the paradigm I'm going to show you is one in which they get 5 auditory DRM lists of 10 words each, 10 words, 10 associated words. Then they get the video and either a specificity or control induction, as you've heard in previous studies. And then they just do recall all the words from that list that you heard earlier. And then later in the session, everything, of course, counterbalanced. They do another series of auditory DRM words. They get either the control or ESI, whichever one they didn't get the first time, and do further recall. I should mention that we did an experiment where we presented the induction first before everything. That had no impact on anything, and I'd be happy to talk to people about why that might be the case, and that's in the write-up, but for interest of time, I'm just going to show you what actually did produce an effect, and that's giving the induction right before recall. So what happens? Well, if we look at the proportion of studied words that you recall in the free recall test, there's no difference after you just had specificity versus control induction. But there's a pretty big boost in false recall after you've just had the specificity induction, producing a lot, coming up with a lot more of these words like sleep that you didn't actually hear. Well, we thought that was pretty striking, particularly since there's no impact when you presented the induction before the list. So we wanted to replicate that. We did an exact replication, and we got pretty much the same result. A little bit lower overall level of false recall, but once again, there's a boost from the ESI. So ESI seems to be selectively boosting false recall. It's consistent with a constructive retrieval hypothesis that ESI is encouraging construction of episodic details that can help to create an illusion that a non-studied critical lure item appeared on the list and therefore increase false recall. Well, if that's so, and I just got one more experiment to quickly mention because I really like it, then the effects of the induction on false recall might be reduced or eliminated by increasing reproductive retrieval, accurate memory. So if whatever this constructive retrieval process is that's being facilitated by the episodic specificity induction is something different from and counter to reproductive literal retrieval, then if you could enhance reproductive retrieval, then you might actually reduce the impact of the specificity induction on false recall. So that's what this experiment looks like. And we drew on some older work from my lab, Elizabeth Kenziger, many of you know, that was her undergraduate thesis, and some other studies that showed that just very simply, if you repeat these DRM lists, no surprise, you will reduce false recall and false recognition. If you've heard the list 3, 4, 5 times, that gives you a more accurate verbatim memory that allows you to reject the lure items. So would this now work against the false recall enhancing effect of the specificity induction? So the setup is the same as before, experiments are all the same, except now we've got a between subjects manipulation. You're either hearing these DRM lists 3 times or just once. So the once is a replication of the previous studies. A separate group, they get them 3 times. Everything else is the same now. You're getting either the specificity or control induction. And what happens? Well, not surprisingly, after 3 presentations, veridical recall of the words that you actually heard, is boosted. So yeah, you've got a more precise, accurate, reproductive memory of the lists you heard, compared to 1. In the 1 presentation conditions, the third replication of this effect, if you just had ESI, you're coming up with more falsely recalled items compared to control, but that now is totally wiped out if you've been through the list 3 times. So whatever the ESI is increasing, enhancing, it's in opposition to detailed, veridical, accurate memory, because it gets wiped out when people have that kind of memory. Okay, so conclusions, as we just saw, we've got some support for a constructive rather than reproductive retrieval account of this ESI effects, and consistent with this idea, as that last experiment showed, the veridical, when you increase veridical retrieval through studyless repetitions, you eliminate the boosting effect of the specificity induction on false recall. And because this induction, as I've emphasized, enhances performance on a range of tasks that draw on episodic retrieval, including all those that we've discussed, the present results would suggest that these tests are all drawing on a similar constructive episodic retrieval process. We can call it event construction or something like that. And I think this is in line with our constructive episodic simulation idea from 2007. But going back even further, I can't resist closing the talk by citing kind of really the father of constructive memory research, Sir Frederick Bartlett. Lynn Nadell mentioned him yesterday. Can't leave out Bartlett from a talk like this. And he concluded his famous book in 1932 by saying that the first notion to get rid of is that memory is primarily or literally reduplicative. It certainly can be literal. But in a world of constantly changing environment, literal recall, he thought, was extraordinarily unimportant, and he concluded that memory appears to be an affair of construction rather than reproduction. And I hope I've shown you in this talk some of the interesting ways in this new work and sort of broader memory framework that some of Bartlett's ideas about constructive memory are playing out. So thanks to my lab, funding sources, and thanks for your attention.